Sorry for the wait, guys. I firmly believe that things need to be put in their proper contexts in order to be understood. So the main aim of this part of the iceberg is to try and glean what life on North Sentinel Island is probably like beyond these beaches we always see, by exploring what it's like for their closest known relatives on the islands right next door to them. And trust me, they're way more interesting than I first thought they'd be. Like, way more interesting. But unfortunately, by delving into their history, we'll see how their decisions to open up to the modern world, done at different times and to different degrees, have all turned out pretty disastrously for them, which I think really testifies to the idea that the Sentinelese are probably better off having nothing to do with the modern world. As crazy as that might seem. Anyways, without further ado, let's begin. British rule, 1858 to 1947. So without going any further, I should probably explain what the British were doing in the Andamans in the first place. British colonization of the Andamans began in earnest in 1858, when their first permanent settlement there, named Port Blair, was established on South Andaman, on the east coast opposite the west coast facing North Sentinel. It mainly functioned as a penal colony for Indian prisoners that had taken part in the Indian Mutiny of 1857, and that's why the most well-known historical attraction in Port Blair is called the Cellular Jail, though it was built much later in the 1890s. But 1858 didn't mark the first time the British had hitched up on the Andamans, and that wasn't even the first Port Blair they made. In 1788, Lord Cornwallis, the Governor-General of India, sent Lieutenant Robert Colebrook and Lieutenant Archibald Blair to survey the Andamans and write a report on how suitable it was to colonization. The islands were already being shortlisted as a penal colony, and a British presence on the islands would be able to safeguard British shipping in the area against Malay pirates. One of their other motives was also just simply to grab a hold of the islands before any other European power could take it, which makes a bit more sense when you consider that the Danish, of all people, had colonized the Nicobars just south of the Andamans, and all sorts of other strange continentals like French Jesuits and Moravian missionaries had been milling about there for some time. The next year, a free settlement was established right on a little island next to the future site of Port Blair, named Chatham Island. And in honor of Cornwallis, it was named Port Cornwallis, but it wouldn't stay there for long. In 1792, it was moved to another spot on the northeastern coast of North Andaman because of the new location's vastly superior harbor, but was soon abandoned because of how swampy and disease-ridden it turned out to be, which killed off way too many settlers to justify its continued existence. And the British basically abandoned the islands in 1796. In fact, the islands continued to be notoriously unhealthy, with their simultaneously hot and damp climates and the prevalence of mangrove swamps and creeks, which were of course hotbeds of malaria. For the next 60-odd years, nothing much was done with the Andamans, though the British still maintained their claim and showed it by keeping a station ship in the islands. The Andamans entered history yet again in 1824 when the site of Port Cornwallis was chosen as the rendezvous point for the Royal Navy ships about to take part in the First Anglo-Burmese War, but the British government only felt compelled to further impose themselves on the island after two of their troop transports bound for Calcutta, the Runnymede and the Briton, happened to both get themselves wrecked off the island's coast simultaneously and basically right next to each other in 1844. But it would take them quite a while to organize their solution. That was until early January of 1858, when the British East India Company steamer Pluto, carrying what was referred to as the Andaman Committee, arrived off the coast of South Reef Island, and its first interaction with the Andamanese turned disastrous. The British waved a white handkerchief to try and signal their friendliness, but a scuffle ensued, and 3 Andamanese were shot dead. The Brits remarked that one quote-unquote chief collapsed almost with the dignity of Caesar, which tells you a lot about where their minds were at, eh? But one Andamanese man happened to be captured instead. He was immediately renamed Jack by the ship's crew and taken back to India for the interests of humanity, where he was dressed in European clothes, taken on carriage rides, measured, photographed in the nude, shown off at tea parties, and, of course, contracted cholera. After less than 2 weeks there, Despite his worsening condition, he was dumped back on Little Reef Island with his clothes heaped in a pile on the sand and some gifts to give to his compatriots that are eerily reminiscent of those given by Indian authorities in the 70s. Things like pots, pans, beads, mirrors, carpentry tools, cloth, thread, etc. If the Andamanese were living through the zoo hypothesis, then what Jack went through is the equivalent of an alien abduction. But that was only their first taste of what the British had in store. The penal colony was quickly established at the original site of Port Blair and was frequently attacked by the Andamanese, which culminated in what's known as the Battle of Aberdeen, which took place on May 14th, 1859. The British had been forewarned of an impending Andamanese assault by an escaped convict named Dudnath Tawari, who began living with the Akabeada, but I guess he didn't feel any gratitude for their hospitality, so he squealed to the British and was eventually released for it. But despite the initial bloodshed, by around 1860, friendly-ish relations were established with some of the Andamanese from the same group that had attacked them at the Battle of Aberdeen, and they began visiting the penal colony to obtain exotic new commodities. In 1863, Lord Napier of Magdala visited the islands and wrote a memorandum suggesting certain reforms. He also secured a grant from the government for the maintenance of something called the Andaman Home, and for quite a while afterwards, iterations of that Andaman Home would be at the center of British policy towards the Andamanese. But it wasn't too much of a home. It's where kidnapped Andamanese people would be brought so they could be taught about the wonders of British civilization before being returned to their communities with presents, in the hopes that in doing so, the British would be able to tame and civilize them in a conciliatory way. To be fair, the Brits' official line was that they were pursuing a policy of kindness and tact, and that any unprovoked aggression against the Andamanese was strictly forbidden. But I'm not sure if the people at the end of that policy would consider it kindness and tact. Under its initial founder, Reverend Henry Fisher Corbin, conditions were akin to slavery, and that's what later British authors wrote. They were housed in a glorified cowshed on Ross Island and put to work with convicts doing forced labor like clearing forests. Their forests. Illnesses that would eventually spread across the islands immediately ravaged their numbers, and after many of its occupants escaped, the rest were put under armed guard, and some were even clamped into irons. Corbin also managed an orphanage specifically meant to educate Andamanese children in English, Urdu, and basic arithmetic, with the end goal being to make them servants. But its pupils resented being restrained so much and escaped so often that, according to the later British administration, the orphanage was continually empty. Reverend Corbin's successor as head of the Andaman Home was Jeremiah Homfray, who was one of the first people to mount an expedition to North Sentinel Island, and seems to have been far more sympathetic to the Andamanese. He even reportedly visited their encampments for days at a time, where he'd allow them to paint his face like theirs and danced with them. He moved the home to the mainland, and it became a bit more popular among the Andamanese, and so they began working with the British more willingly as a result. But things were still definitely amiss. Almost all the children born in the home died in infancy, and the Andamanese were still forcibly put to work crewing boats, which caused many desertions, as they put it. In 1874, a number of new homes were established at various strategical points around the settlement under the supervision of the convicts, but that turned out to be a pretty terrible idea because they became too intimate with the Andamanese and wound up giving them syphilis, which even became hereditary among some, and later in 1877, measles, which created an epidemic that accelerated the island's rapid population decline. Portman later commented, "It is sad to see the ravages which syphilis is working among them, and their numbers are becoming less year by year." And he spoke of how there were so many bodies in some places that no one was left to bury them. Grim stuff. There were some 3,000 convicts in the Andamans by 1864, which increased to a peak of at least 11,500 in the early 20th century, though that quickly began to change. In the 1920s, the penal colony was ordered to be shut down, and regulations governing how strictly regimented the lives of the convicts were became more lax. They were even given the privilege of sending for their wives and children in India, and jobs became voluntary and waged rather than compulsory. The islands were captured by the Japanese in 1942, who ruled them under the pretenses that it was actually being run by a rogue Indian nationalist government based in Singapore, which we'll get to in the next video. It's an interesting story. And after a few more years of British rule following the occupation and the closure of the penal colony at the close of the war, the Andamans were allotted to India after it obtained independence in 1947, though there seems to be a bit of confusion over whether or not it formally became a part of India until 1950. The Indian settler population grew dramatically, especially with many refugees being resettled in the islands following the partitions of India and Pakistan, putting even more pressure on the Andamanese. Extinction. Okay, so this isn't really an entry in itself, but it does set the tone for the next 4 entries, which are about the closest known relatives of the Sentinelese. And unfortunately, like the Sentinelese, each of the distinct groups I'm going to talk about are either perilously close to extinction or already extinct. And as I just alluded to when talking about the British occupation of the islands, that's objectively mostly because of their contact with the outside world. The Great Andamanese. And in that same vein, the most notable thing about the Great Andamanese is that they're on the very brink of total extinction. And remember, I'm not talking about some podunk insect or some flightless bird, no. I'm talking about a unique group of human beings. Like, to put things into perspective, there are only around 30 of them left, though that figure might be as high as 48 or 57, but as a big caveat to that, few, if any, remain without some sort of Indian admixture. And this is all despite the fact that the Great Andamanese once were the most populous and diverse and geographically spread out group on these islands. And the most ironic thing of all is that their precipitous decline wasn't caused by them resisting the British, it was because they became their closest allies. The history I discussed in the last segment mostly applies to these Great Andamanese. Colonial administrators like Portman called them our Andamanese, and others referred to them as friendly tribes, as opposed to less friendly groups like the Sentinelese, so most of the 19th century photos I showed in that segment, many from Portman himself, are of the Great Andamanese. When the British pitched up for the second time in 1858, they were divided into 10 or so distinct tribes, with all sorts of different names, speaking related but not necessarily mutually intelligible languages, and they mostly kept to themselves. In fact, some tribes weren't even aware that some of the other tribes even existed. The names differ in older sources, but from north to south there were the Akabea, Akabale, Apusikwar, regarded as the oldest of the lot and also possibly known as the Pujukar today, the Akakol, the Okojawoi, the Akakidi, the Akajeru, the Akabo, which was the last tribe to be discovered because they mostly dwelled in the forest, the Akakora, and the Akakari. I don't know. And all of these further subdivided themselves based on where different members of the tribe got their food from. The Arioto or Ariauto lived along the island's coasts and obtained food from its beaches, mangrove swamps, and coastal forests. And they sort of looked down on their counterparts, the Aramtaga, who lived in the island's interior forests. And they weren't necessarily too fond of one another. Apparently this also might apply to the Sentinelese, but the difference is apparently way milder among their closest relatives, the Onge, who seem to change environments based on the movements of the winds. So who knows if it's really a big deal now. But the terrible epidemics brought to the islands as a result of the penal colony's creation had an absolutely catastrophic effect on their numbers. In 1858, when the British established themselves on the islands for their second and final time, they estimated that there were some 5,000 of them. But by 1867, there were only 3,000. And by 1911, there were barely 209 of them left, mostly because of the hereditary syphilis they inherited from what went on at the Andaman homes and just insane general infertility. Their birth rates were perilously low. The many different tribes that once existed in the 19th century were dissolving by the 1890s and lost all cohesion as entire clans died out and survivors married whoever was available, irrespective of their tribal origins or even whether they were Andamanese or not. And so because the tribes only kept existing for such a short while after the British first identified them, it's possible that some existed and then just disappeared without ever being recorded by outsiders. Scary thought, and by the time of the 1931 census of India, local census taker MCC Bonington seemed to think that the end of the race appeared in sight, but he was talking about how there were only 209 left when he'd last checked in 1911. When he rechecked that in 1931, there were only 90 left. Apparently the men among them were completely sterile, and the only children being born among them were the offspring of Great Andamanese women and Indian convicts. So by 1995, it was established that no individual identified as Great Andamanese was without partial Indian or Burmese lineage. And as a result, they now speak in a hybrid Andamanese, Hindi, English, Pidgin language. So they're rapidly losing fluency in their own ancestral languages. However, because a large number of the surviving Great Andamanese are descendants of the Akajeru tribe of North Andaman, it's also called New Akajeru, or Jero. And interestingly, Jero doesn't have any words for yesterday and tomorrow, before and after, or for days of the week. When asked point blank if Jero had any names for the days of the week by a researcher, one of the Andamanese women replied, "We learnt it from you." But this doesn't mean they were ignorant of the passing of time or anything, far from it. Jero has up to 8 different words for different stages of the morning alone. But anyways, because they're made up of a hodgepodge of the descendants of other Great Andamanese tribes, some other tongues have also survived. Very unfortunately, they're dying out. For example, just in 2020, a Great Andamanese language known as Sare, spoken by the Aka Sari, completely died out, and the last woman to speak it, named Licho, died of tuberculosis. But not before working to preserve its vocabulary by collaborating with Indian linguist Anvita Abi. The last speaker of the Aka Bo language, a woman named Boa Senior, pictured here just to Licho's right in this 2001 photograph, passed away a decade earlier in 2010, though she also sung songs and told tales in her language for Professor Abi. They and the rest of the Great Andamanese lived and live on a tiny reservation on a small island around the middle of the archipelago, 250 kilometers northeast of Port Blair, called Strait Island, which apparently mostly consists of government-built concrete houses with few amenities, though their food, clothing, and healthcare is provided to them, and they're even given monthly allowances in cash. The Indian government has also been trying to assimilate them further by teaching them Hindi and English, but they're still not in the best shape. Many suffer from diabetes, and unfortunately most are alcoholics. According to TK Pandit, they remain disorganized and directionless, though the situation was improving, at least as of 1990. But this was in the midst of them being continuously exploited and taken advantage of sexually and through different addictive substances. And the men were apparently being treated like serfs by settlers. They were also all pretty impoverished. In a much later interview with The Hindu, Pandit even recalled how some of them had to resort to pitching up in the deserted World War II-era bunkers left behind on the coastline by the Japanese. He also recounts how he saw a frail, elderly Andamanese woman named Ronnie reduced to begging for alms in the streets of a local bazaar, singing a mournful song and being harassed by local children. It was clearly a very painful sight for him. So one of Pandit's most lasting impacts in the area, in addition to making contact with the Sentinelese, was his part in creating the Great Andaman Reserve on Strait Island. For the last 30 or so of them left in 1970 to give them more social organization and to put an end to the rampant exploitation they'd been subjected to. Though many of them do still seem to remain active around Port Blair, where the Indian government established a modern-day Andamanese home called Adibasera, and some have, or at least had, jobs in the city working for the government. Though it's a bit unclear now, because the local government seems to flip-flop between trying to isolate the Andamanese and forcefully opening them up to the outside world. For much of this period, they were also ostensibly led by a king, or Raja, named Jarawa, who notably helped save his kinsmen from the disastrous 2004 tsunami, with his quick thinking by shepherding them to the top of a hill right before it hit. And it's even been reported that he predicted the tsunami days in advance, when he noticed how warm the water was getting. Jarawa supposedly wielded absolute authority over all 50 or so of the other Great Andamanese, and after he passed in 2005, his wife, Surmai, started being styled the Queen of Strait Island. And recently, she even met with the Indian president, Drupadi Murmu, when she came round to the Andamans in 2024, in order to gift her a replica of a traditional musical instrument. Jarawa also had many children. like a daughter, Princess Tango, who took a liking to television after one was supplied by the Indian authorities, and she was apparently a big fan of the Bollywood actor Shah Rukh Khan. One of her sisters was the Licho I mentioned earlier. Their other sister, Boro, worked as a traffic cop in Port Blair and seems to be featured in this 2009 documentary, while another one of Jarawa's daughters, named Rengi, even worked in Port Blair's Anthropological Museum. And interestingly, she tried to petition the local authorities to be allowed the ability to marry her Bengali lover, which they'd actually forbidden her to do in order to avoid diluting the Andamanese gene pool even further. But unfortunately, they're not all doing too well. Sometime before 2015, one of Jarawa's 10 children, a son, was found begging on the streets of Port Blair. The Onge. I'm excited to talk about these guys. If I could talk to anyone from any of these stories, it'd be one of these guys. And who knows, maybe one of them knows English. Anyways, the Onge, who call themselves that because it just means human being to them, are pretty universally regarded as the closest living relatives of the Sentinelese, along with the Jarawa. And they're all categorized as belonging to a larger Little Andamanese group, distinct from the Great Andamanese, who were historically rather hostile to them, and even expanded southwards at their expense. The Little Andamanese, also referred to as the Onge Jarawa, or even the Onge Jarawa Sentinelese group, once controlled the islands as far north as Port Blair. But then in between the first and second settlements by the British, the Great Andamanese supplanted them there, probably after they were weakened by imported diseases. As a result of this, the Onge were forced to retreat to Little Andaman, and stopped venturing further north than the Cinque Islands. The Onge are definitely doing a little better than the Great Andamanese, but they're still only just clinging on. I mean, there are only around 100 or so of them left, and they used to live in 3 small reservations, and then 2 reservations. Now they're just in 1, called Dugong Creek. For his part, T.K. Pandit seems very concerned with the way things are going for them, and in 1990 he wrote that they're likely to follow in the footsteps of the Great Andamanese. He reports that their women are still safe from the same sort of exploitation that's unfortunately befallen the Great Andamanese women, but they're now increasingly dependent on outside help and consumer products from outsiders, and he's reasonably worried that if the Sentinelese opened up, they'd befall the same fate too. But oddly enough, early contact with the Onge was actually way more fraught than that attempted with the Sentinelese. In 1867, they slaughtered the small crew of a ship called the Assam Valley. That in turn resulted in a punitive expedition being launched by the British on the IGS Arakan that resulted in some 30 to 70 Onge being gunned down. 5 Victoria Crosses were given out for this. The Onge had to deal with yet another ruthless punitive expedition from the British just a handful of years later, in 1873, after 5 men from a Chinese junk named the Quangoon had stopped on Little Andaman for water and then disappeared into its jungle. The British, under one General Stewart, then decided to send the Onge a message by burning down several of their large communal huts, including one that was a whopping 60 feet in diameter and that was estimated to accommodate up to 150 people. The Onge were traditionally divided into different septs, with strictly defined borders, that all lived in big beehive-shaped communal huts just like that. And to make matters worse, in the same mold as what he tried and failed to do with the Sentinelese, Portman dealt with the Onge by kidnapping some of them from the Cinque Islands so that they could be tamed and eventually brought back to their compatriots with presents, which they'd hopefully be grateful for. Oddly enough, it actually worked this time. Portman established a stable relationship with the Onge as he was simultaneously mounting his expeditions to North Sentinel in the 1880s. And because Portman had actually encountered the Sentinelese first, shortly before encountering any of the Onges, he reported that, "I noticed that the Onges, whom I now saw for the first time, resemble the aboriginals of the North Sentinel, were smeared with yellow clay, had their hair clipped, but not shaven, and had bows, arrows, and canoes exactly like those I had seen on the North Sentinel in the previous month." Interestingly, the patterns of this yellow face paint are drawn by the women of the Onge, and women use patterns taken from her family on both her husband and children, which interestingly is one of their few little hints at hierarchy. Portman also noted that the arrows used for shooting fish frequently have 4 heads of different lengths fitted into one shaft, similar to those found on North Sentinel, and he seems to have had a high opinion of them, saying, "I hold that the Onge group are the mildest, most timid, and inoffensive of all the Andamanese." In 1886 and 87, he began to notice that they were horribly affected by diseases like syphilis, scurvy, elephantiasis, malaria, and bronchitis. It's possible that they were spread among the Onge by Malay pirates even before the British were even on the scene, because they had been visiting the islands to raid the plentiful birds' nests and its limestone caves and captured native slaves for who knows how long. Though it was probably the British, in my opinion. Either way, these diseases rapidly reduced the Onge's numbers, and that's one of the main reasons they went from a population of 672 in 1901 to their current measly population. But the Onge themselves explained that all the havoc wrought by foreigners, which they refer to as Ineni Lao, made arranging marriages way more difficult. The anger of the spirits in the Ineni Lao caused few daughters to be born to the Onge. Young men married old women who had lost husbands, or the men waited for marriage and grew old, waiting for the right woman. Story of my life. Anyways, since then, especially after 1958, Indian government officials, including anthropologists, medical personnel, administrators, and others, have frequently visited the island. The 40s and 50s mark when the Onge started to become really quite open, but it also marks when the island was flooded with Indian refugees, fleeing the conflict on the mainland. And unfortunately, it also seems that the Indian authorities have shown much disregard for the Onge. In 1977, large tracts of land on Little Andaman were just arbitrarily confiscated and given to settlers from India and something called the Forest Development Corporation. So the Onge were relegated to only 110 square kilometers of land on their island of 700 square kilometers. Though Pandit gives a somewhat conflicting report, saying as of 1990 that the Onge resource area is still quite large, about 350 square kilometers, as the development work has somehow been slowed down, partly deliberately. But either way, the land available to them has shrunk, which does not jive with their traditional nomadic way of life at all. But now that the island's been opened up to large-scale settlement by mainlanders for so long, their population dwarfs that of the Onge at least 30-fold. And since their traditional hunting and collecting ground and pathways like those on North Sentinel have been seized, the Onge's traditional way of life is disappearing. For example, they've had to stop creating the large dugout canoes they're accustomed to, which can hold up to 30 people. And that's since around 1990, because of all the deforestation that's been going on, which is compounded by the terrible soil erosion it causes. It was only in 2002, following legal intervention by 3 different NGOs, that this deforestation was apparently put to an end, though we'll have to see. And it's just such a shame. The Onge's original way of life seems so beautifully tailored to their environment. Like the Jarawa, they move around in accordance with the severity and direction of monsoon winds, which they both call totote. By the way, they think winds are the experienced form of the spirits, and they try to avoid them because they don't want to be hunted by them, which is interesting. So from October to January, when the northeast winds are blowing, and when its spirits come to the forest, but the southwest winds aren't at the coast, they camp along the seaside and collect food like turtles from it. The rest of the year, to avoid the southwest monsoon winds hunting in the sea, they hunt pigs from April to September, and before that they collect honey in March and February in the interior, when the northeast winds apparently aren't there. So you can see how important moving around must be to them. Because of how limited their resources are, given the nature of their island home, they always make sure to only take just what they need from it. And in addition to pigs, that goes for other foods they gather, like mangrove seeds. But when they kill a pig, they mark where it happened by cutting a notch into a nearby tree branch and bending it so it'll wither, signaling that no more pigs should be taken from that area. And they always make sure to hunt downwind of the pig so it doesn't detect their smell, which they think also attracts spirits. And I'm also stunned by just how compassionate they are to one another. Because no one person can eat a whole pig by themselves, they share the meat with everyone. And they don't just share pigs like that, they share everything. Like if you ask for an ornament of theirs, they'll just give it to you, because they reason that today I might be successful, tomorrow I might not be in hunting or whatever. So sharing ensures that no one goes hungry. They're almost completely egalitarian to boot, with nominal chiefs and elders barely distinct from everyone else that are only respected if it's in an individual's self-interest to do so. But there are some things about their culture we'd find a bit unsettling too. Marriage take place at around 10 or 11 before puberty, and women often become grandmothers in their 30s or even 20s. So keep in mind that their life expectancy is around 40. There was a way to get out of marriage. Since the ceremony simply consisted of an elder placing the girl's hand in the boy's, it would be considered void if she released herself and just ran away. As we'll get into later in the next video, they also wear the jawbones of their deceased relatives as mementos, a practice reportedly shared with the Sentinelese. To give the Indian authorities due credit, it does seem like they're trying to teach the Onge some new skills to better ingratiate them with the modern world. For example, Pandit says that a new plantation has been started where fruits, roots, and tubers, bananas are grown with the idea that the Onge will learn the technology themselves and soon take it over on their own. An electric generator has also been installed. Some bush police personnel were also posted there for some time for the protection of the Onge from outsiders. Some new techniques of fishing are also being taught to the Onge. One Onge youth has been nominated as a member of the Territorial Council to represent all the Andaman tribes to give a psychological boost to their sagging morale. That was written in 1990. But archaeologist Irene Cooper, who worked with the Onge too, paints a pretty bleak picture. By the 80s and 90s, the Onge of South Bay were mostly suffering from pulmonary diseases and had frequent bouts of dysentery and malaria, made worse by the fact that the Indian authorities at a place called Hut Bay were 20 kilometers away on a dirt path they only had bicycles to navigate with, and medical professionals only rarely visited their settlement. They even reported to her that lack of timely medical help often results in loss of life, and Pandit remains pessimistic, perhaps rightly so. From an independent, self-reliant, and virile society, it is gradually becoming more and more dependent, without any parallel compensating factor to minimize the impact, and docile vis-a-vis the dominant society. Could we describe this as development and progress in the real sense? The Jarawa. Despite living on the very same islands as hundreds of thousands of Indian settlers, the Jarawa remain almost as resistant to the modern world as the Sentinelese are. But let's go back. Ironically, they were some of the very first Andamanese to meet with the British all the way back in 1790, when they lived around what's now the southern end of the harbor of Port Blair, though the British had no idea who they were at the time. But it's been reported that Lieutenant Colebrook even went so far as to bring some back to Calcutta with him, and they were seen as being more amicable than the Akabeada living on the harbor's northern end, who'd eventually completely replace them in the area when the British returned in 1858. The Akabea went so far as to prove it themselves to Portman by showing him legit archaeological sites left behind by the Jarawa. These were their kitchen middens filled with the refuse left behind by long-gone villages, which included certain things the Akabea just refused to touch, apparently. The word Jarawa even means stranger in the Akabea language, but they call themselves something like Yaenga. And just like the word Onge, that just means something like human being. And the two words probably share a root. Despite their friendly start, as the British began solidifying their hold over the islands in the latter half of the 19th century, their relationship with the Jarawa inevitably turned violent. And part of this is likely because, with the Akabea going from being the Brits' biggest opponents to their closest allies, they began blackening their rivals' names. And to compound that, the British started using them as guides in their attempts at finding elusive pockets of Jarawas in the jungle. And these Akabea guides were even issued with guns, possibly shotguns. So, as you can imagine, the Jarawa became as afraid of the British as they were of the Akabea, their historic enemies. The Jarawa were also pretty hard to pin down for the British, because whereas the Onge live along the seashore and in the forest, the Jarawa almost exclusively live deep within their dense jungles. And here I should probably mention what little we do know about how they live there. For all intents and purposes, it seems pretty similar to how the Onge make do. They have these giant, semi-permanent communal huts meant for whole clans known as seps, but most of the time they're out and about, living in smaller groups as nomads, in temporary encampments consisting of some 14 or so of the same kind of lean-to huts seen on North Sentinel Island. And funnily enough, I was even able to find this drawing made by a Jarawa guy at the instigation of some researchers, showing the differences between the large, elaborate community huts on the left and the more simple, smaller lean-tos. Like with all the attempts at trying to locate the Sentinelese within the interior of their forests, The British and their Akabea guides were only ever met with deserted villages and the occasional elderly or child straggler, who were invariably kidnapped and brought back to Port Blair to be shown the wonders of civilization. And in another unfortunate parallel with Portman's ill-fated expedition to North Sentinel, these hostages often rapidly sickened and then died. Despite that, some did seem to warn to the British, at least at first. Two young Jarawa men caught at different times in the late 19th century, one named Talai and the other named Ike or Ike, each learned a bit of Hindi and English, and seemed to get along well with their captors, until they each quietly slipped away. Portman never heard of Talai again, but Ike briefly reappeared as part of a Jarawa raiding party, and was last heard throwing curse words at them in Hindi. But despite that, the Jarawa did seem to respect Portman a little bit, though they certainly didn't respect his successor, a guy named P. Vaugh, who they butchered in a skirmish in 1902. The British also later started suspecting that the Jarawa also probably weren't big fans of having their forests cleared en masse to make way for the penal colony. The Jarawa also probably eventually began noticing that the Great Andamanese, who'd once overpowered them, were becoming increasingly scarce after being in such heavy contact with the British. In 1872, the first recorded Jarawa raid on the British settlement occurred, and according to Bonington in 1931, from then to the present day, scarcely a year has passed without raids being made on the settlement to obtain iron implements, etc., etc. I guess he couldn't be bothered with listing what else they wanted. The conflicts arising from these raids are sometimes known as the Jarawa Wars, and they arguably continued up until 1997. In 1884, they intensified a bit as the British dropped their attempts at trying to befriend the Jarawa and further incentivized the Akabea to show results by withholding their rewards unless they did so. But the wars really ramped up in the 1910s and 20s, when several exterminatory punitive expeditions were launched against the Jarawa. But despite that and all the disease floating around, they've survived. They only managed to avoid extinction by retreating to the most remote areas of jungle on the rugged western coasts of Middle and South Andaman, which they migrated to after having initially been forced into the southeastern corner of South Andaman by the Akabea. They also traditionally deal pretty ruthlessly with anyone who trespasses into their lands, but sometimes they're just completely at a loss to do anything. It's been reported that during the Japanese occupation of the islands during World War II, Jarawa settlements were machine-gunned following the death of a Japanese soldier in the area. The British punitive expeditions were put to an end in 1947, but like the British, the post-independence Indian authorities had a policy of attempting to win over captured Jarawas. Here's a photo of one of them being kept under observation at the cellular jail in Port Blair back in 1970. He was given the glass beads he's shown wearing, and after 5 days he was dropped back into the forest with gifts for his countrymen. Bush police outposts were also established around what's known as the Jarawa Reserve, which caused what Pandit obliquely refers to as various incidents. Indian government functionaries in Jarawa continued to be killed in skirmishes back and forth, and the Jarawa were accustomed to launching occasional nighttime raids against the Indian settlements abutting their reserve. Another huge bone of contention that arose between the settlers and the Jarawa was the opening of something known as the Andaman Trunk Road in 1971. It connects Port Blair in the south with Dijalpur in the north, and thus passes through Jarawa territory. And even though its use is regulated and you need a permit to drive through it, it's still been a disaster for the Jarawa. The roads consumed a huge amount of their forest, has brought in tons of new settlers into their lands, and likely brought about the onset of a devastating measles outbreak. So it's been the cause of Jarawa attacks and ensuing counterattacks ever since. But just as gift drops were being made by goodwill missions on North Sentinel Island, the local authorities also sent gift drops to the Jarawa. One launched in 1974, filmed as part of the Man in Search of Man documentary, where we get our earliest footage of North Sentinel Island, seems to have broken the ice a little bit, at least in a certain area. The Jarawa were gifted red cloth and were given a sample of some modern music, and based on the footage, everyone seems to have had a pretty good time. And they continued. Here's footage of a more substantial gift drop, reportedly from 1993. where you can see the Jarawas being given lots of food, like these bananas. And by the way, the roster of gifts they were given include all the same things given to the Sentinelese, like coconuts, pots and pans, bits of iron, and simple tools. As of 1990, Pandit commented, "They have survived in a better and healthier manner than both the Great Andamanese and the Onge have done after close and friendly contact with us," and that at the time the Jarawa were at about the same level of contact that the Onge were at around the middle of the 20th century. But just after the Sentinelese allowed outsiders to get the closest they've ever been to them in 1991, everything also changed, but this time much more permanently, for the Jarawa. In 1997, the Jarawa finally began opening up to the outside world on their own fruition. In 1996, a Jarawa teenager named Enme was found on a roadside on the outskirts of a town named Kadamtala, groaning in pain and with a broken leg. It's possible that he fell out of a fruit tree while plucking its fruit, which is the most popular version of the story, but Vishwajit Pandya reports that when he questioned Enme about it, Enme sheepishly admitted that he'd been beaten up by his lover's family, possibly for good reason. Either way, he then spent the next 5 or 6 months in Port Blair's hospital, and during his stay there, he was apparently seduced and bedazzled by the wonders of the modern world, learnt some Hindi, and soon became a go-between for a certain segment of Jarawa and the Indian settlers. And that especially goes for his boys, shown here. So other Jarawa started coming out of the jungle and began interacting a bit more peacefully with the people of the Indian villages on the frontier adjacent to their reserve, like Tarar and Kadam, where more fruits and coconuts were offered to them by the local authorities. Funnily enough, some villagers were offended by their nudity and gave them oversized clothes to wear in their presence. And Enme continued to fulfill that role for a few years. In 2002, Enme was even made to symbolically hoist the Indian flag up somewhere in the Jarawa Reserve, I guess, as a message. But in 2004, things changed yet again, and Enme withdrew back into the forest after getting married. It's even been theorized that he initially failed to complete the boar hunt called Lepa, necessary to get approval for his marriage in the first place. So instead, he was trying to prove himself by showing that he could bring back material gains from the outside world. Apparently, he'd also killed his would-be father-in-law for not letting him marry his daughter, so there's that too. Ironically, the boars that started all this are becoming harder to find in the first place because of poaching and outside encroachment onto Jarawa forests. So it's all a bit circular. Nevertheless, Enme still convinced his compatriots to make peace with the Indian authorities. But this all came at a cost. Several of the Jarawa were found to have contracted chest infections that appeared to be viral pneumonia in September of 1998. But luckily, a lot of mortalities were prevented by prompt medical care, and the Jarawa themselves were eager to get regular checkups, at Enme's insistence. Though at least 90 of them were later struck by a measles epidemic that afflicted them in the fall of 1999. But interestingly, the word they used to refer to the hospital and the road leading to it was the same one they used to refer to trees, something like pepe, as they all lead to finding new things. And they liken traveling along that road to crawling up a tree as it leads to finding new things, like food, and in the road's case, metal. And finding new places like Port Blair with the road was like spotting new places from high up in a tree. They were also given new things at the hospital, like clothes, just as the trees in the forest provide them with honeycombs. And May even went so far as to draw what he was talking about, and that's what you're looking at. But the Jarawa are still definitely in a pretty tenuous situation. Their population, for instance, is still thought to be in general decline from what it once was, but our picture is pretty sketchy. It was estimated to sit at just around 600 in 1858, only for that figure to rise to 1250 in 1883, which turned into 585 in 1901, then possibly sank to a number as low as 120 in 1931, before bouncing back to 250 in the 80s, and then declining again to only around 200 in 1990, and there are still only around 240 or maybe 380 of them now. The Indian settlers bordering Jarawa territory are also increasingly vocal about their demands for more farmland, though strangely there is a form of silent barter that goes on between them. In return for tying pots and pans to tree branches, the Jarawa will leave things behind for the settlers, like packs of resin and wild honey. And they've even gone so far as to try to sell stuff like homemade beeswax candles on the Andaman Trunk Road. And that's another thing. They now know they can leverage their distinctiveness for profit. Like, for example, they've refused to be photographed in hospital unless they're paid. But another, somewhat sadder form of this is how some Jarawas have become accustomed to begging on the side of the Andaman Trunk Road. And they dance for the amusement of tourists in exchange for bananas and other bits of food, which the local tour companies were happy to profit off of course, at least until they were banned from interacting with the Jarawa in 2008. And in 2013, it was judged that tourist traffic down the Andaman Trunk Road was illegal, though after petitions were made against it, the ruling was reversed. But traffic still apparently has to be organized in convoys and are under official scrutiny, whatever that means.
They are totally different from ourselves. They are not developed as we are. So I wanted to see how they are living and what are they doing here.
And to make matters even worse, poachers have infiltrated their reserve. In exchange for bushmeat and hardwood, they apparently give back alcohol and venereal diseases. Groups of Jarawa have actually spoken to the media about this. In 2008, Survival International released a video of some coming out of the forest to say that they were tired of Burmese poachers stealing their turtles. So if they're willing to make that effort, it's clearly pissing them off somewhat. And a 2013 article reports that, shockingly, another group of 10 Jarawas actually protested at a government office in Kadamtala, telling the crowd of Indian onlookers in Hindi that they were going hungry and needed food, and wanted to appeal in person to the lieutenant governor of the islands. The New Indian Express even claimed that their leader, a youth named Afi, stated, "We want our children to study in school like the Onge children. We also want to become Bada Admi, or rich." So it seems like the Jarawa are increasingly emulating the Indians and are becoming more dependent on the Indian government for things as basic as food. And I think this is well represented by the fact that if you compare all the footage of them, you'll realize that the newer a reel is, the more likely it is that you'll see a larger number of them wearing more substantial amounts of modern clothing, as opposed to the chest guards and elaborate floral adornments they traditionally wore. Nonetheless, some pretty unique examples of cross-cultural hybridization have arisen out of this. This is a Jarawa girl wearing a necklace made out of candy wrappers, and this is my favorite, a Jarawa guy in his new shades. Pretty tough. The Jangil, extinct circa 1907. The Jarawa and the Sentinelese are universally regarded as being pretty closely related, or even allied, and one British colonial author, M.C.C. Bonington, even speculated that the Sentinelese are just an offshoot of the Jarawa that inadvertently drifted out to sea. But interestingly, Portman theorized that the Sentinelese occasionally visited a place called Rutland Island, a hilly island just south of South Andaman and about parallel with North Sentinel, to interact with the incredibly elusive inhabitants of its interior. Rutland Island and the smaller islands near it seem to have been sort of a nexus point or frontier between the Great Andamanese from the north, whose inhabitants on Rutland were closely allied with the British but were hit hard by disease and rapidly died out by 1890, the Onge, these guys, and maybe even the Sentinelese themselves. Now, the Jangil do seem to have been some sort of subset of Jarawas, so they're also often called the Rutland Jarawas, or even Rutland Onge, since Portman wrote that he suspected they were maybe land-bound Aramtaga members of the Onge, who were left behind as they fled south from the Akabea. Though when he eventually befriended the Onges, they said they knew nothing of the Jarawas on Rutland. Also, when briefly taken to North Sentinel in 1867, some Akabea identified the Sentinelese as the same sort of Jarawas they'd previously had violent encounters with on Rutland Island. But the fact that the Jangil had their own unique name among the Great Andamanese, Jangil, suggests that they were at least somewhat distinct, and this is further reinforced by the fact that one of the only Jangil individuals we know about, a man who seemed to be named Halia, who was captured by the British in July of 1884, could not speak the same language as the tribe of Jarawas on the mainland, according to Portman. The latter could, however, distinguish a connection between the two languages, and declared that at some former period they were undoubtedly the same. The thing is, unfortunately, the Jangil are completely extinct, and have been for at least a century at this point. The 1931 census claims that none of them had been seen since 1907, but reports I've seen vary. Some say they disappeared in 1905, or as early as the late 19th century, or as late as the 20s, but any way you look at it, they're gone, which is a real shame, especially considering that there's good evidence to suggest that they were some of the Sentinel's closest kin, and that their home, Rutland Island, was their main nexus of contact with the other Andamans. Hopefully I'll be able to get more into that in later videos. Many of the very sparse references to the Jangil are just comments on how similar their culture was to that of the Sentinelese. I mean, we don't even have any pictures of them. Just this one photo of some deserted huts of theirs taken by Portman when he went on an expedition to Rutland Island to try finding them in the 1890s. And by the way, the barely discernible people you can just barely see sitting in the huts are probably just some of his Great Andamanese lackeys. Portman reports that the bows of these Rutland Jarawas, as he sometimes called them, often looked like the ones he'd seen on North Sentinel and Little Andaman. And when talking about the Sentinelese, he comments that they most closely resembled the Jarawas on Rutland Island. And because he was an upper-class snob, he adds that there is a peculiarly idiotic expression of countenance and manner of behaving common to both. Yes. And in keeping with that, he also named a whole bay on the eastern edge of Rutland Island after himself. What a humble guy. And he also comments that he'd seen the same sort of temporary camps lodged between the roots of giant trees on both North Sentinel Island and Rutland Island. But as far as Portman knew, the Rutland Islanders were firmly bound to dry land and didn't even have canoes, and instead just used rafts to cross creeks. Though he was hardly ever able to track them down despite putting in a lot of effort to do so. Like seriously, if you look through his work, he's constantly going to Rutland Island, constantly failing to find them. It's like a running gag. Portman did deduce a number of things about them, like that there were probably less than 30 of them, that they had no canoes, live in the interior, specifically the jungles of its southern half, and in former times were said to be numerous. He also said, I found several of their villages, some containing as many as 16 huts, and from their tracks am of the opinion that they do not live altogether, but go about in parties of from 8 to 10 in number. But that's basically it, and we can't really know much more about them than that, I guess, until we dig up the sites of those villages Portman mentions, because they're just all gone now. What happened to them is the worst case scenario for the Sentinelese, and for that matter, all of the remaining Andamanese tribes. And I can't help but wonder if this has anything to do with why the Sentinelese mistrust us. Even if it isn't, it certainly shores up the rationale of their decision to have nothing to do with us. The tablet. Besides the Sentinel's own trails and buildings, which they do have, though they are pretty minimal, you'd probably think that no one from the outside world has ever been able to build or put anything permanent on North Sentinel. But surprisingly, you'd be wrong. On March 30th, 1970, an official surveying party, including Pandit, landed at an isolated spot with a safe enough boat landing somewhere on the northwestern coast of the island to erect a so-called territorial slab, proclaiming that the island is territory of the Republic of India. So maybe I should have called this the slab, but whatever, it's the same thing. Here's how Pandit described the event. We reconnoitered the area for any signs of hostility or surprise attack and gave protection to the PWD men as they put up the territorial slab. Work was completed in an hour's time. They first examined the future site of the slab on the afternoon of the 29th, and Pandit remembered noticing some interesting things. Some footprints, and where these disappeared into the jungle, a few remains of what appeared to be a canoe and a length of nylon rope. And on the spot where the present territorial slab stands was a sort of crude lime kiln. We found a few burnt shells. So I guess the Sentinelese have nylon now, and I wonder what they use the lime for. As plaster? To make beetle quids? I don't know. Oh, and just as a side note, this was right after the Indians had retreated from a tense situation on the southeastern corner of the island that only ended when a few Sentinelese women began initiating something Pandit refers to doubly as community mating and as a frenzied dance of desire. Make of that what you will. But ultimately, it seems the very way they chose to bury a native hearth with the slab sort of mirrors the hubris that motivated its installation in the first place. It's the Sentinelese island, and they never willingly let anyone else on it for more than a few moments, but it's part of India because these guys covertly erected a slab there and because maps say so. Not trying to diss India or anything, it's just the Sentinelese don't know they're a part of India. So are they really a part of India because we say they are? Or I don't know. The Man in Search of Man incident, 1974. Man in Search of Man refers to the title of the documentary that captures the extraordinary but abortive encounter that took place between Indian officials and the Sentinelese in 1974. Our main source for it is our old friend TK Pandit, who witnessed what happened firsthand and wrote about it in his handy book about the Sentinelese. Now, for context, this was 7 years after his first experience with the Sentinelese, and this time he was accompanied by a bunch more people than before, including a film crew from the Indian government making the documentary Man in Search of Man with him, and an acclaimed Indian photographer working for National Geographic named Raghubir Singh. And along with that film crew, he has the honor of being first to photograph the Sentinelese in 1974. Just let that sink in. This entire ethnicity hadn't been photographed until the 70s. This is one of only 2 encounters I was able to find footage of, and the photographs from this event have become iconic representations of the island. I even used one in the thumbnail, and I totally get why. The silhouettes of the Sentinelese facing the expedition down as they bend over to ready their arrows, and especially this guy making these weird rhythmic movements, are eerily reminiscent of ancient petroglyphs. It really is like looking through a time machine. But the exact events that surround the taking of this footage is even more interesting. The encounter lasted multiple days at the end of March 1974 and involved a way bigger contact party than the last expedition sent to the island in 1970. Beyond the journalists, there was a police escort whose members wore padded armor and held shields. I know people, including myself, who endlessly speculate about how they'd try to land on Sentinel and leave unscathed. And we often think that the solution to being fired at with arrows is wearing some sort of armor and having these same sorts of shields. But this real-life incident clearly shows that even with all those precautions, the Sentinelese would still definitely overwhelm you, no question. Beyond the police, the party roster also featured the Deputy Commissioner of the Andaman Islands, the Superintendent of Police, a doctor, a social worker, and of course some anthropologists. But the most important crewmen had to be 3 Onge men, named Napi Kotai, Kanjo, and Tambale, who were brought along because, as mentioned earlier, their language is the closest thing we've got to Sentinelese. Though the events of that day make it a bit difficult to ascertain the degree to which they were able to communicate with the Sentinelese. Here's what Pandit recalls about what was going on in the background when these moments were being caught on camera as the Indian contact party was approaching the beach on a motorized dinghy. Crowding into the boat, we headed towards where the Onge had pointed. My expectations on seeing the Sentinelese were high. Suddenly, when we were 150 yards from the shore, one Sentinel emerged from the forest, a dark, well-built man pointing a drawn bow and arrow at us, with 2 arrows tucked into a belt of bark, his only clothing besides that being bark strips around each bicep. There was excitement on the boat. The Onge were given the mouthpiece of the loudspeaker, which Chowdhury, the social worker, held pointed towards the Sentinelese. 9 others crept out of the jungle with drawn bows. The Onge shouted, "We are friends, come close, we mean no harm, we come in peace." We were about 80 yards from them. One Sentinelese took a few steps forward, bent his body back, and aiming towards the sky for a high trajectory, shot an arrow which hit the metal sides of our boat with a loud clang. We were taken aback. The Deputy Commissioner shouted for the boat to be moved back. From a distance of 100 yards, which was considered safe, the Onge sang, "We come from a distance to befriend you." The singing brought a response from one Sentinelese, who moved his hips and his feet in tune to the boat. The Sentinelese shouted back something which the Onge seemed not to understand. Kanjo quite clearly said in Hindi, "I do not understand what they say." The Indians then attempted to win the natives' friendship over with an assortment of gifts. The armored police disembarked from their dinghy and hurriedly left a variety of gifts on the sand after finding a landing spot out of arrow range. The gifts were a bit weird, but then again, the Sentinelese are the world's hardest people to shop for. They included a miniature plastic automobile, some coconuts, some bananas, a Yorkshire pig with a tether on it, a child's doll, lengths of red cloth, and some green and red aluminum cooking pots. The policemen then retreated back to open waters to observe the Sentinelese' reaction. At first, they seemed receptive. One woman who emerged from the bushes with a cane basket on her back picked up everything except the red cloth. As the Yorkshire pig tethered to a bush was hidden, we were not sure whether it had been taken. She lifted some coconuts, smiled, and waved them towards us. Since they had accepted the gifts, it was decided to go nearer. But the Sentinelese didn't take too kindly to that. Their response was yet another hail of arrows, which hit the director of the documentary in the left thigh. I suppose they should have just left money instead. Anyways, the Sentinel man responsible was seen laughing proudly and then walked away to the shade of a nearby tree to sit down and bask in the glory of his achievement. This entire time, rocks and pieces of driftwood were apparently being flung at the landing party, so I have no idea why they decided to continue. That's sort of a universal way of saying F off. Anyways, time for a brief side tangent. The photographs that were taken for National Geographic were later circulated in an article published in July of the following year in that month's National Geographic, and entitled Arrows Speak Louder Than Words, The Last Andaman Islanders, drawing yet more attention to the island. Even a former European monarch came by to check the Sentinelese out afterwards. And trips from the different bureaucrats stationed in the Andamans on hardship postings also began increasing in frequency. Those same bureaucrats would also sometimes even bring their families along for little picnics off the coast. What's especially ironic about this is the fact that the respected anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who asked Indira Gandhi directly if his students could do fieldwork among the islanders, was turned away. Though then again, that was probably the right call anyways. You just wind up with a bunch of dead graduate students. So that was probably more out of concern than corruption. According to T.K. Pandit again, Indira Gandhi took a special interest in and had deep concern for the welfare of the remaining Andamanese natives, based on his 2 brief meetings with her he had later on in March 1981 and February 1984. Unrelated tangent aside, the Goodwill Party decided to return later that afternoon. Pandit recounts that we were about 100 yards away when the Sentinelese appeared from the bushes. Some wore yellowish headbands, armlets, and waistbands, unlike those in the morning. Was it the same group in new attire or a new one? One woman, or was it a man, had some leaves tucked into her belt at the back, like a Jarawa boy Pandit had seen earlier. As we went closer, they became agitated. An arrow passed over the center of the boat on level with our heads. We ducked and it splashed into the water behind us. Suddenly, 2 Sentinelese ran and climbed a tree, appearing on a limb 15 feet above the ground, which provided them with a better trajectory. But they did not shoot, as we were too far away. We moved away and left gifts at the same spot as in the morning. They watched us, but not until we had gone several hundred yards away did they pick them up. An entire line of women, carrying empty baskets on their backs, trooped out and walked down the beach with a single armed man keeping guard. They then returned back into the forest at a point where a few temporary lean-to huts, similar to structures built by the Jarawa, were just about visible. The next morning, while attempting yet another landing, they witnessed something pretty exceptional. 2 or more bands of Sentinelese reuniting and embracing in a rather affectionate way. But Pandit theorizes that this represented every fit male on the island regrouping to face off against them. Through my lens, I noticed several of them hugging, while one sat on the other's lap. The embrace continued for minutes. This was the same form of greeting used by the other Andamanese when different bands or persons met after a long separation, the period of the embrace being in proportion to the length of the separation. Obviously, the 45 men before us comprised 2 or more bands. Perhaps all the males except the aged and the babies of the estimated total population of 150 persons were before us. The word had probably gone round, and they had collected to meet the threat to their territory. There were some boys among them, and one woman was breastfeeding a baby she carried in her arms. Their first few gifts of the day went over pretty well, though they understandably chose not to land because the Sentinelese sprinted over whenever they got close to the beach. And they threw some plastic buckets into the water, and the man who picked it up was delighted. He tested it out in the water by filling and emptying it and then walked away proudly, according to Pandit. By the way, the Sentinelese do have buckets, they're just made of wood. But later, when they tried to leave some of the same kinds of gifts they had left the day before, including another Yorkshire pig, things went south. Again, we tried to land. This time they simply watched us leave 1 doll, an axe, 1 pink pan, a saw, 1 Yorkshire pig, aluminum dishes, and coconuts. Suddenly, several of them broke into a sprint. The first one to reach speared the pig with 2 quick thrusts and piled sand over it. The doll met the same fate, but not all the gifts were refused. A boy picked up the aluminum dishes and waved them at us. More arrived and a man walked away with the pink plastic pan on his head, his jaunty gait revealing his delight. One Sentinelese took the saw with a smile. A boy took the axe, walked towards the trees and stood in the shade watching us with his leg around the handle and left hand resting on the inverted blade. But assumedly to make sure the would-be landing party didn't get the wrong impression, one more arrow was fired at them, though intentionally or not, it missed its mark. Interestingly, it was found to be triple-pronged and had bone tips. And Pandit gives a phenomenal conclusion to the story. As we were returning to the ship, the wireless operator announced that the pay commission had given the superintendent of police an increase in his salary. We were back in the 20th century. Fire! So it seems that there's a bit of contention online over whether or not the Sentinelese have access to something as basic as fire, and even if they cook their food or not. But I mean, they clearly do, and on both counts. As we've seen, the first ever record of North Sentinel Island is a remark about how many bonfires were spotted on its beaches at night. And every time a Sentinelese village has been entered, fire's been found in each of their constituent huts. And every time a Sentinelese village has been entered, fire's been found in each of their constituent huts. For instance, Portman reported that the Sentinelese do their cooking exactly like the Onge, and in 1896 he commented that he found 2 houses with 10 leafy beds each and the same number of fires on one of the beaches. In 1967, during his first visit to the island, Pandit observed that in each of the 18 huts he encountered, there weren't just 1, but 4 to 5 separate controlled fires, still burning at the corners of each of those huts. He added that each of them was separated from the hut's interior by rows of vertical sticks. Pandit theorizes that they were there to ward off venomous snakes or insects, so despite how idyllic their lives might seem from some perspectives, the Sentinelese do still probably have to deal with nasty little BS like that. In 1970, Pandit further noted that he even saw gratings of 18 inches by 18 inches by 18 inches over extinct fires that seemed to be used for cooking. So there's a unique kind of Sentinelese barbecuing out there, I guess. One other 20th century Indian history of the Andamans even goes so far as to say that the Andamanese are expert cooks and adept at preparing delicacies from parts of animals and fishes, and that food is always cooked and usually eaten very hot. Speaking of that, the Onge have a pretty ingenious way of adding a nice aroma to their fish by cooking it in pleasant-smelling leaves and by steaming that between hot stones. They also apparently roast jackfruits on these same sorts of fiery stones. The real question is, are the Sentinelese capable of starting fires, or do they just carefully preserve embers from lightning strikes in hollowed-out trees, as some sources claim? Classic anthropological studies, like Radcliffe Brown's 1906 work, claims that no, they can't produce fire, but that makes it incalculably more precious to them than we could possibly imagine. I mean, just take it from Radcliffe Brown himself.
Fire may be said to be the one object on which the society most of all depends for its well-being. It provides warmth on cold nights, it is the means whereby they prepare their food, for they ate nothing raw save a few fruits. It is a possession that has to be constantly guarded, for they have no means of producing it and must therefore take care to keep it always alight. It is the first thing they think of carrying with them when they go on a journey by land or sea. It is the centre around which the social life moves, the family hearth being the centre of the family life, while the communal cooking place is the centre around which the men often gather after the day's hunting is over. To the mind of the Andaman Islander, therefore, the social life of which his own life is a fragment depend upon the possession of fire, without which the society could not exist. In this way it comes about that his dependence on the society appears in his consciousness as a sense of dependence upon fire and a belief that it possesses power to protect him from dangers of all kinds.
Fire was even said to magically protect against spirits and disease, and apparently the Andamanese take fire sticks wherever they go at night, so like in Terraria. But more bizarrely, the traces of pretty large-scale fires have been detected on North Sentinel Island fairly recently. Some 12 years ago, in early March of 2014, plumes of smoke and a massive burn scar covering some 123 acres of the island's northwest near the wreck of the Primrose were picked up by satellite imagery. At the time, there was a bit of a commotion over the idea that this might have been caused by the wreckage of MH370, which infamously vanished in the Indian Ocean on March 8, of 2014. But although data from the Worldwide Lightning Location Network, or WWLLN, demonstrates that this probably wasn't caused by a random lightning strike, and an Indian government expedition sent to investigate didn't report seeing the downed plane, fires on the island had been detected by satellite imagery even earlier in the year, and it's possible that the fire wasn't even detected until the 10th. So North Sentinel Island probably isn't the resting place of MH370, which we'll probably get more into in future. Other theories explaining this big anomalous fire range from campfires just accidentally growing out of control, the recklessness of illegal loggers trespassing on the island, and even the notion that the Sentinelese have started to test out some kind of slash and burn agriculture. Who knows? South Sentinel Island. So I think you've all probably been thinking this, because I know I have. If there's a North Sentinel Island, then there must be a South Sentinel Island, right? And there is. It's 60 kilometers, or 37 miles south of North Sentinel, or a 6-hour boat ride south of Port Blair. And like North Sentinel, it's mainly composed of jagged coral that's difficult to walk on, but nevertheless still has giant trees growing out of it. South Sentinel is also much smaller, at only 1.6 square kilometers. It's far less elevated and remains uninhabited, though it still did have an important role to play in local tradition. Portman attempted to reach it in November of 1886, but had to turn back due to bad weather. The Andamanese then with him said that they called it Kilaga Gowai, but said they had never been there. But the Onges did go there to procure turtle because it's one of their favorite nesting spots. Now, unfortunately, their numbers are dwindling thanks to poachers that have been trawling the seabed around the island. And that's the island's main feature. Like North Sentinel, it's a delicate sanctuary that's remained almost untouched since the beginning of time, except this time it's a sanctuary for animals, not people. But also like North Sentinel, it's still very fragile and in a lot of peril thanks to the meddling of modern society. It doesn't seem to have any fresh water on it other than a small shallow marsh in the middle, but it's teeming with all sorts of different critters. And it's especially popular with robber crabs, aka coconut crabs, aka the crabs that ate Amelia Earhart. And the government of India designated the island as a sanctuary for them back in 1977. And in addition to crabs and sea turtles, thousands of pied imperial pigeons nest there too. And a variety of reptiles from big to small call the island home, including saltwater crocodiles, the Andaman water monitor, and my favorite, the little neon green Andaman day gecko. Some sea eagles have also been spotted brooding over its treetops, and it's also reportedly the occasional home of other scarce birds, like the Nicobar pigeon and the threatened Andaman crake. So if these guys got as far as here, maybe these are the same sorts of species that live on North Sentinel. And there's only one permanent trace of humanity on the island. A tall iron lighthouse painted in alternate red and white stripes that's barely just perceptible on Google Earth, sitting at the far northeastern tip of the island. Okay, first things first, to address the giant elephant in the room, this video was not originally as heavily censored as it is now. The reason for all that is because as I was uploading it, YouTube decided that it had an ad suitability issue, whatever that means. So either I would get limited revenue or no revenue at all. Keep in mind, this is my job right now. So I had to send it in for manual review, and they seemed to confirm that it was because the people I talk about weren't exactly very fond of clothes until recently. And this is despite the fact that I covered up everything in the original draft. I still don't know why it wasn't enough, but hopefully this makes do. And in case it still isn't monetized, that's okay, but please consider checking out some of my other videos. Oh, also, I'm probably going to upload the original uncensored version to my Patreon, if you're interested. Thank you guys so much for watching, and make sure to join the channel Discord, link in the description, if you want to meet a bunch of interesting fellow history enjoyers. It's honestly pretty fun, and I'm on there like all the time. Plus, I wouldn't have been able to finish this video without the help of some of the people I've met on there, like Kacper and Crimson. So thanks for the help, guys. Also, thank you to the artist Blue Gibraltar for drawing the latest version of the channel banner. I think you'll all agree that it's pretty awesome. Anyways, to be honest, I'm going a little island crazy right now, so I decided that the next video has to be something completely different. But I just have so many different ideas for what to do. Unfortunately, I'm also famously indecisive, so after weeks of agonizing over what exactly to do, I realized that the best way to move on would be to put things to chance. And that's exactly what I did with this spinner wheel. So it looks like I better be brushing up on pyramids because the next video is gonna be the ultimate pyramid iceberg. But I can't end the video without thanking my wonderful esteemed patrons, starting with Dhruv Singhal, Bajun, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Danny Banani, Little Bluebird, James Kirk, Booga420, Alyssa P, Mark Elliott Cullen, Jemek Worsbitsky, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, Akune, Mark Krupnik, Miha Needog, Michael, Daisies for Ghosts, Prince of Men, Julie Lau, Zafiro, Bean Burrito, Albert Vaclav Smejkal, The Spoofer, Emily Cujo, Stevan, Greifenfrost, Hippolyta, Magna de Broiker, Julia Erickson, JP Van Splunder, Joseph Talley, Petra S., Generic Brand, Ryan Gregg, Glubber Bob, 20 Trillion, of course, Skiku, Mason, Bread, Brandon Wood, Giovanna Lazzarini, Patrick Darius Grimodka, Artem, Chris J., Max S., The History Enjoyer, Daniel Battery Stapler, Machado de Assis, Menda Pruska, Alex Pauliciccio, Lazy Ram, Weston Van Diver, Board Lord, It's Premium, My Man, Yogg, Jane Geeky, Theodore, Ice, Kate Dalgleish, Cameron Llewellyn, Lori Weeks, and our newest patrons, Brett O, CJ Carrera, Trico, Kevin Chachowski, Alco, Nigel, Leland Swallow, Artil, Aspergirl, hey, Dr. Kagaz, Brandon Thint, and finally, DJ Panda Bear 52. Thank you guys so much for your support, and I'll see you soon. Hopefully.